Chapter 234 Restrictions and Spiritual Medicine. When Han Li heard this, he secretly said in his heart, "Sure enough, he asked about this matter." However, he still appeared stunned outwardly and exclaimed, "Primordial spirit? This disciple has not seen any sort of primordial spirit. Could Senior Marshal Brother Li's primordial spirit have left his body before he died?" Han Li had decided in his heart long ago that as long as the other person asked about the primordial spirit, he would insist that he didn't know anything. Could he really tell his Marshal Senior that he had extinguished the primordial spirit after it tried to possess him? "You didn't see it?" The fatty gazed at Han Li for a while with an enigmatic smile. His gaze caused Han Li to feel unsettled, and his heart thumped repeatedly. Since you didn't see it, Senior Marshal Brother Lin's primordial spirit could have been lost inside the Great Formation and dissipated on its own. The fatty said indifferently, his face twisting after a moment. Hearing this, Han Li let out a sigh. However, he was very clear in his heart that the fatty did not believe what he said, but based on Marshal Senior Lei's seemingly nonchalant attitude towards Senior Marshal Brother Lin's survival, he would not investigate too seriously. After all, everyone knew that the first thing a cultivator's primordial spirit would do after leaving the body was to immediately attempt to take over someone else in order to be revived. However, apart from Han Li, no other cultivators were present in the formation, so the only body that could be possessed would have been Han Li's. Since Han Li was still fine, it could only mean that Senior Marshal Brother Lin had failed to possess his body and his primordial spirit had been eliminated. As for whether or not Han Li's body had been appropriated by Senior Marshal Brother Lin's primordial spirit, could Senior Marshal Brother Lin be controlling Han Li's physical body? The answer was even more obvious at a glance. This was because possessing someone was very harmful to the primordial spirit. Even if the possession was successful, there was simply no way to control someone else's body freely without spending at least a week to recover behind closed doors. Naturally, this Marshal Senior Lei could see through it. Thus, both Han Li and Lei Wan were both well aware of how Senior Marshal Brother Lin's primordial spirit met his end. However, because his initial impression of Han Li was pretty good and he was too lazy to ask about this kind of matter, this fatty allowed the topic to pass somewhat carelessly. On the other hand, Han Li, who understood clearly what was happening, still pretended to be confused because he knew that no matter what his reasons were, if this matter were to spread, he could not escape from the offense of mutilating a cultivator from the same sect. This would be very unfavorable towards him. But in this way, Han Li actually felt that this Marshal Senior Lei was much more pleasant than his own master. Marshal Nephew's cave is truly too crude. How can you welcome outsiders in this way? Although we cultivators aren't too concerned with these things, it still has to be at least barely passable. For some reason, this Marshal Senior Lei didn't leave this location after finishing up his business. Instead, he stood at the entrance to Han Li's cave and began to slowly evaluate. Upon hearing this, Han Li bitterly laughed for a moment. He had only used a few days to leisurely construct this cave. How could he find time to be meticulous? However, Han Li thought of another matter after hearing his Marshal Senior mention this. Thus, after laughing briefly, he respectfully said to Lei Wan, "Marshal Nephew has a few matters that I want to ask Marshal Senior Lei about. Can Marshal Senior Lei come into this disciple's cave and rest for a moment so that this disciple can slowly explain it to Marshal Senior Lei? In addition, this disciple has a few mature medicinal herbs. I want to ask Marshal Senior to appraise them so that this disciple can use them to refine pills with reassurance." Medicinal ingredients. The fatty's expression originally did not change when he heard that Han Li had some questions for him and wanted him to enter his cave. However, when Han Li mentioned that he had a few old medicinal herbs, a trace of a smile appeared on his face, and he nodded in agreement. Thus, Han Li invited Lei Wan into the hollow, large entrance hall. Then, he said he would go and retrieve his spiritual herbs and asked Lei Wan to wait for a brief moment. Afterward, he hurried into his storage room and retrieved 2 600 or 700-year-old herbs, then returned to the lobby. Han Li didn't carry those few spiritual medicines inside of his storage pouch with him at all times to preserve their medicinal properties over a long period of time. Using jade boxes or other similar magic tools to store spiritual medicines was only a temporary method. Over long periods of time, its medicinal strength would still slowly leach away. Thus, practically every cultivator's cave had a secret storage room. Only in this way could one guarantee the medicinal properties of the spiritual medicine would not be lost. However, because Han Li was worried that this Marshal Senior Lei's spiritual sense was extraordinary, thus allowing him to see the items hidden in his storage room as well as the spirit wellspring, he had activated the 5 elements reversal formation's spiritual sense blocking magic much earlier. Now, if this Marshal Senior Lei wanted to snoop around, he would most likely be very disappointed at this moment. That jade slip had made it very clear that breaking off one's spiritual sense was very simple to implement as an additional ability, so when this ability had been refined into the set of magic tools, it was similar in strength to the complete formation, not weaker than it in the slightest. This was also the only effect in which it was comparable to the complete formation. After Han Li had set up the large formation, he had once tested the strength of this ability. As expected, his spiritual sense could only spread a few feet around him. There was simply no way for him to further increase the range of his spiritual sense. As for this Marshal Senior Lei, even though he was a core formation cultivator and his spiritual sense would inevitably surpass Han Li's, he most likely would not be able to search beyond the 100-foot-long entrance hall. This was also the reason why he dared to invite the other person in. Otherwise, the other person could use his spiritual sense to sweep both the secret storage room and the spirit wellspring that he had sealed up. He believed that this Marshal Senior Lei one most likely did not harbor any ill intentions. However, it would probably have been worse if he hadn't invited this Marshal Senior Lei into his cave at the beginning, which would only serve to increase the fatty's suspicions. After all, if a Marshal Senior were to arrive in front of a junior's cave but wasn't invited into the cave, it would truly be somewhat out of the ordinary. Even if the other person were to overlook it initially, once they thought about it carefully after the fact, wouldn't it be even more of a disaster? In addition, there were some things that Han Li actually wanted to ask this fat Marshal Senior, and he genuinely wanted to develop some connections with this person. After all, he was a core formation cultivator. If Han Li were to build up a positive relationship with this Marshal Senior, it would be very beneficial to him in the future. As Han Li quietly thought this to himself, he held 2 medicinal boxes in his hand and walked into the entrance hall. Then, in front of Lei Wan, he took off the covers of the boxes one by one, asking the other person to perform the so-called identification. At this time, Lei Wan felt very unhappy in his heart. This was because he had actually sent out his spiritual sense when Han Li went to retrieve the medicinal ingredients, wanting to survey and size up the extent of his cave. This wasn't because he had any malicious intentions, rather, it was a subconscious action that he performed as a core formation cultivator. However, his spiritual sense had only left his body a distance of roughly 100 feet before it could not continue to disperse even an inch. It felt incredibly sluggish, as if 500 kilograms had been placed on his spiritual sense. This caused Lei Wan's large face to immediately reveal an expression of shock. It wasn't that he had never been in circumstances where his spiritual sense was limited. He had experienced these circumstances many times in the caves of cultivators he had good relations with. This meant that there were some restrictions in place that could cut off one's spiritual sense. However, his friends were all core formation cultivators. The fact that their caves had these kinds of restrictions was not so strange. However, this Marshal nephew was clearly a foundation establishment cultivator, and this cave appeared to have been constructed not long ago. For this kind of restriction to appear in this cave was quite strange indeed. Lei Wan did not actually connect the appearance of this restriction with the formation outside of the cave. This was because to him, it was already very impressive for the large formation outside the cave to have such a strong defense. If it could also be manipulated to break off one's spiritual sense, wouldn't it be similar to the great protector formations of some small sects? How could such a strong restrictive formation appear outside of a Foundation establishment cultivator's cave? This Laowan most likely never could have imagined that Han Li's formation was actually the simplified version of the widely known 5 elements reversal formation. Even if its magic power was only 1/10 that of the original formation, it would not be much worse than the city faction's great formation. Thus, when Han Li opened the medicine boxes for him to look at, the fatty's heart was still pondering this matter. His gaze did not actually immediately go towards the contents of the box. It was as if it didn't matter whether he looked inside the box or not. However, when his gaze finally landed upon the 2 600 or 700-year-old medicinal herbs, his originally laid-back attitude immediately disappeared. As for restrictions in spiritual sense, he tossed these to the back of his mind. At this time, Lei Wan's eyes existed solely for these 2 medicinal herbs that released a very pressing spiritual qi. This disciple bought these 2 spiritual medicines in the secular world for quite a few spirit stones. However, Marshall Nephew's experience was too shallow, and I had no way of determining the age of the medicine, which is why I never used them. Marshall Sr. Lei's arrival today is very timely. You can help Marshall Nephew identify them. Mn. Lei Wan didn't hear what Han Li said at all. He carelessly mn'd a few times before carefully picking up a spiritual medicine and scrutinizing it in detail. Han Li secretly watched the other person's expressions very carefully and lightly smiled in his heart. It seemed he had picked the correct spiritual medicines. He had heard others mention that core formation cultivators' need for spiritual medicine greatly surpassed that of Foundation establishment cultivators. After reaching the realm of core formation, one mustn't easily say that they wished to turn their core into a nascent soul. It wasn't a matter of simply cultivating one's magic power a layer higher, it was a matter that was beyond difficult. Thus, taking lots of medicinal pills became the common way for core formation cultivators to raise their magic power.